When Disney released Cinderella in 1950, Lady Tremaine's role as the evil stepmother seemed pretty cut and dry, but it turns out there was a lot more to it, and it's a lot more depressing than you might think. Like most Disney villains, Lady Tremaine has been more and more fleshed out over the years with new movies, shows, and books, revealing more about the sinister woman who gave stepmoms a bad name. But thanks to Cold Hearted by Serena Valentino, the 8th book in her Disney villain series, fans now have an even clearer vision of what her life was like before she became Cinderella Stepmother. And it turns out, one of the worst things that Lady Tremaine could have ever done was marry Cinderella's dad. Before having her husband and the father of her child tragically ripped out of her life, Lady Tremaine was once known as a kind-hearted and happy woman. Though she was shown in Disney's Cinderella as being a rude and vindictive tyrant that put the evil in evil stepmother, there was actually a lot more to her before she was ever a part of that world. You see, according to Serena Valentino's book, Cold Hearted, Lady Tremaine had an entire life before she met Cinderella's father, and would actually prove to be a much happier one than Sir Richard ever gave her. Sadly, her happiness didn't last forever, and when tragedy struck, it turned out to be just the first domino in her life that was about to set off a chain reaction that changed Lady Tremaine's personality for the rest of her life. In Valentino's book, it was revealed that Lady Tremaine came from a very wealthy family, and on top of that, it turns out that Cinderella's father wasn't the first person that Tremaine had married, which makes a lot of sense considering the fact that she had two daughters of her own, Anastasia and Drizella. And thanks to Serena Valentino, fans now have a better insight into what her first marriage was like and how it ended so terribly. According to the book, Lady Tremaine and her first husband lived in London, and they both loved each other very much. Sadly, this was the only time that she would get to feel that love. She and her husband had two daughters, and all in all, they were a very happy family. That is, until Lady Tremaine's husband became ill, and considering the time period, there wasn't much to be done about it. According to Cold Hearted, her husband passed away from the illness, which turned Lady Tremaine into a widow left to raise two children on her own. Little did she know that this would only be the first of many terrible things to happen to her, and though she would eventually remarry, her next husband was a fiend compared to her first. While Sir Edward may have seemed like a true prince at first, Lady Tremaine didn't see him for what he truly was until it was too late, a leech. As the book explained, Cinderella's stepmother was a wealthy woman, and now that she had been widowed, there were various suitors that pined for her attention. However, most of them were likely only looking at the money that she came with rather than the woman herself. And at the time, she was still mourning her husband, so for 6 years she remained alone and Lady Tremaine raised her daughters by herself. That is, until the unexpected happened and she found what she thought was love again. But it wasn't everything that she thought it was, and this newfound love would only prove to be more misery in disguise for the wealthy widow, and it was all at the hands of Sir Richard. In Valentino's book, Sir Richard was already a well-established man in the Many Kingdoms, the fairy tale world within Serena's villain series, and much like Lady Tremaine, he too was once a happily married man with a daughter named Cinderella. But following the death of his wife, instead of properly mourning or even looking for actual love again, Richard just wanted to find someone to take the burden of chores and raising a child off his back. Disgustingly enough, this was where Lady Tremaine fit into his equation. In Cold Hearted, Serena revealed that the pair actually met at a house party that was thrown by one of Lady Tremaine's friends about 6 years after the death of Lord Tremaine. She became acquainted with Sir Richard, though that would prove to be one of the worst decisions of her life and the biggest reason that she turned into such a wicked stepmother. Lady Tremaine and Sir Richard bonded in Valentino's book over the fact that they were both single parents who'd been left alone after their spouse's death. And even though she was described as being a practical person, Lady Tremaine somehow fell head over heels for Sir Richard, and after knowing him for only 2 days, she accepted his outlandish proposal. Not only that, but she also agreed to uproot her entire family to move to the Many Kingdoms with her 2 children, despite the fact that she came from a vastly different world. But fear of that unknown wasn't enough to deter the widow. After being fed a bunch of false promises of love and happiness by Sir Richard, she went through with the marriage and moved into his home, only to find out that it was all a sham. And as readers would soon learn, this marked the beginning of a horrible life for Lady Tremaine, a life that drove her practically insane. After Sir Richard begged her to move into his home in the book, she was elated. However, as she arrived, Lady Tremaine quickly discovered that it was not the life that she was promised. Much like she had mourned the death of her husband, Sir Richard was apparently still fawning over his deceased wife, which there would be nothing wrong with, except for the fact that he lied to Lady Tremaine about being ready to move on, for what the book showed was really just a way for him to trick her into a life of servitude. In Cold Hearted, it really seemed like Richard Richard had married Lady Tremaine so that he would have someone to cook and clean for him, as well as someone to act as a nanny for Cinderella. Only what made this extra sweet from his perspective was the fact that when he married Lady Tremaine, he also gained control of all of her wealth. And it was truly disgusting reading about how he used the money that was left behind by her late husband to pay off his debts. Serena Valentino made it clear in her book that Sir Richard was no Prince Charming, and instead that he was just a con man who ruined the life of a woman who was only looking for consolement during a dark time in her life. Sir Richard was a cruel man and even abusive at times, but no matter how much she tried, Lady Tremaine's calls for help would go unanswered long enough for her warm heart to turn truly cold. And it's not like she didn't try. According to Valentino, after she discovered her new husband's true motives, Lady Tremaine tried to reach out to her friends in London asking for their help to find a way out of the kingdom. No matter what she tried, though, nobody ever came to rescue her. This was largely shown in the book to be because of the fairies and witches that dwelled within the many kingdoms. They didn't want her cries for help to be heard, so they made sure that they never got out. And in the end, Lady Tremaine was left with nothing but hatred in her heart and remorse for the life that she not only subjected herself to, but also her two daughters. Slowly but surely, Tremaine's life with Richard was painful enough to warp her, a once kind woman, and twist her into the cold-hearted, vile stepmother that the world met in Disney's Cinderella over 70 years ago. Lady Tremaine's sanity was tested countless times during her short life within the many kingdoms, and it was only a matter of time before it finally snapped. Even Sir Richard's death wasn't enough to settle the disturbed heart of the now two-time widow, and instead, the book saw her continue to become cold and cruel, especially towards Cinderella, as you saw in the animated classic. Granted, that could be because nobody tried to help her during what could only be described as a difficult time in her life. In fact, it actually seemed in the book that the entire realm of the many kingdoms had been against Lady Tremaine from the start. So it's no wonder that she turned out to be such a cold-hearted villain. In the book, that's literally what they told her that she was going to be. You see, in the world created by Valentino and Disney, there's a book known as the Book of Fairy Tales, and it essentially acts as a scrying totem where everyone in the world's story is written out. That means in Cold-Hearted, Lady Tremaine's life was actually predetermined for her before she was even born. And if that wasn't sad enough, Lady Tremaine was literally told that because the book dictated that all stepmothers were evil. No matter what she did, as soon as she became Cinderella's stepmother, she was destined to become wicked. Valentino managed to write a heartbreaking backstory for what was originally a two-dimensional villain who was evil for the sake of being evil. And in it, she showed that no matter how hard Lady Tremaine tried to fight against fate, there was nothing that she could do. And eventually, she snapped. Lady Tremaine turned into the cold and cruel woman that Disney intended her to be, even turning her cold shoulder toward her biological daughters once there was no one else to direct it towards. That's actually how Cold-Hearted started off. It described a time after Cinderella had already been married and was actually asking her fairy godmother to help Anastasia and Rosella because they were suffering at the hand of Lady Tremaine. Only Cinderella left out the key fact that Lady Tremaine was only doing that because she'd been driven insane by the lies, abuse, and cruelty that she suffered at the hands of Sir Richard. What do you think? Would Lady Tremaine's life have turned out better if she had stayed in London rather than being swooned and inevitably conned by Sir Richard? Make sure you let us know in the comment section below.